You are listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
The Archaeology Podcast Network is sponsored by Codify, a California benefit corporation. Visit Codify at www.codifi.com.
Hello and welcome to the Archaeotech Podcast, episode 48. I'm your host, Chris Sims, with my co-host, Chris Webster. On today's show, we talk to Abby Smith Rumsey, author of When We Are No More, How Digital Memory is Shaping Our Future.
All right, welcome back to the Archaeotech Podcast. We've got Chris Sims on the line. Chris, how's it going?
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, well, regular co-host and all. So, then we've got a semi-regular co-host as well, Michael Ashley from Codify. How's it going, Michael?
It's going great.
All right. And now we've got our special guest, and I'm going to do just a little bit of an introduction here. Michael is, he's kind of my digital archival guru. He's who I go to for all this sorts of information, because that's how we're building the Codify software to kind of follow all these principles that we're going to talk about. And when we were at the SAAs in Orlando last year, Michael was reading this book, and he told me I should read the book. So I actually picked it up before we went to the SAAs and started reading it then. And it was just amazing. It was a lot of stuff that we talk about all the time was in this book. So the book from Bloomsbury Press is called When We Are No More. And let me see, there's a subtitle. When We Are No More, How Digital Memory is Shaping Our Future. And it's by Abby Smith Rumsey, who we have on the line. Welcome, Abby.
Thanks. It's nice to be here.
Good. Well, I'll just give a little bit of background on the book. I just got a sentence I actually pulled out of a review, and it says, When We Are No More explores human memory from prehistory to the present and sheds light on the grand challenge facing our world, the abundance of information and scarcity of human attention. There's obviously a lot more to that, but that's kind of something that stuck out to me as what this book is really about. So, Abby, why don't you give us a little bit of background on yourself and maybe why you decided to write this book?
I'm delighted to be here among archaeologists because it's not my field of specialty. I'm actually an historian who's always grown up with textual and written resources. And I'm humbled by the work that people in archaeology do, frankly, to get as much information out of the mute sources that they have. My concern that prompted this book was twofold. First, as an historian that practiced medieval Russian history and did doctoral research in the 1980s when Russia was still part of the Soviet Union. I'd come from a culture in America where openness to resources was taken for granted. And of course, in the Soviet Union and in other countries that consider all information state property, there is no such thing as a citizen asking a question innocently and expecting to be given access to the sources. And this was true even though my dissertation topic was in the 17th century. It was still viewed as a highly political subject, and I was not allowed access to documents. I had many experiences when I was denied access to documents that I knew, and I had a sense, living in the Soviet Union, that this is one of the ways in which power works, that people, in fact, deny access to their citizens or subjects, to their own past, or at least what we would call the evidence of the past, and instead provide a story about the past which accounts for the present. Mm-hmm. My friends in the Soviet Union would say, in their utopian community, they never worried about the future because the future was all set. It was the past that kept changing. And of course, that's profoundly true. I think we're beginning to see a little bit of how that kind of mindset can come in a culture in which information can be overwritten so easily as digital. So I started my historical career actually very aware of the fragility of the historical record and how powerful it is in getting people to understand who they are, where they came from, and more importantly, what they could imagine the future to be. The second thing that led to my writing this book and deciding that it would not be focused just on a specialized subject, but it would be in some ways synthetic or synoptic and talk about the long view of the historical record, is my years spent in the Library of Congress when it was quite blissful years when there's an abundance of these amazing sources in multiple media. And when the digital revolution came along, the whole premise of the library being comprehensive and universal and providing access equally to all citizens became a real conundrum. We didn't know how to do it.
Hmm.
We were very aware that the record was vast. We didn't know what was going to be valuable anymore. And so, that's when these questions about what is important to save, what can we afford to lose, that's when they began to loom very large in my mind. And that's when I began the research on the book, which took me, as those of you who've looked at it,
Hmm.
very far afield from history, including doing a lot of neuroscience, trying to understand what function memory has to begin with. So that's how I ended up writing the book.
Okay. Right, and that's very interesting because we, as archaeologists on this call right now, I mean, we've personally generated. Two of us are cultural resource management archaeologists, Chris and I, the two Chris's here in this country, and I mean, we've generated, rooms full of paperwork, like actual paperwork that's turned into digital files, but the paper still has to be stored, and so we're very aware of how much knowledge we're acquiring and writing down constantly. And that's why that's why it was interesting to talk to you about this and about moving forward into the future, because like we said, as archaeologists, we're constantly recording stuff. It's what we do. If we're not writing it down, then it didn't happen, it didn't exist. And
Yeah.
as we create this new software for doing this with Michael, and Codify, that's very much on our minds. How can we do this in a way that records exactly the right information, not too much, not too little, but just the right information, so that we can have what we need moving forward. And then deciding exactly what that means is obviously the challenge that we're facing. So
Yeah. Let me just say that I was I think that there's no way of knowing in advance what actually is going to be useful in the
for sure.
future. I mean, I think there are certain kinds of particularly scientific data that we generate to answer key questions. I do think we could all agree that the map that we've made of the human genome, that's worth keeping. That's going to be
Hmm.
important. The record of nuclear waste storage, that's definitely important to keep. But in terms of the human record, which is so changeable and it's so subjective in some ways, the only good advice, and I learned this as a medievalist, is to actually record the things that are valuable to you. I know that's not a very specific answer to the question, but there are lots of things as a medievalist I wanted to know about life in Muscovy at the time,
Hmm.
which, those people who could answer the questions weren't even literate. They had no access to recordings. So, in all humility, the historians had to figure out how to answer their questions from the scant historical record that existed. And we started from the premise that whatever there was, in this case there were scribal records and a lot of liturgical records, we had to acknowledge that that's what they cared about. I mean, I think that we can't start any place but that. And so I think that's in some ways what a field like archaeology can at least determine is what you in the present think of as important for your own work. And after all, what's going to be, needed in the future when people will be using machines we can hardly imagine, using algorithms
Hmm.
which are really unimaginable to mine the data. We can't really tell how people will use the data that we generate.
Right.
So you can relax about actually determining precisely what it is that people will need in the future, because the question of what you want to save, because you consider it valuable, is probably hard enough, I imagine, for you all.
It is, and I always go back to the example of Chaco Canyon when I visited there for the first time, and I saw in the museum that early explorers there back in the, I want to say, late 1800s, if not early 1900s, they would camp, just in the walls of of the main pueblo there, Pueblo Bonita, and they built their fires right where they could see that other fires prehistorically had been built. And now there's no carbon-14 dating that can be done there because they completely destroyed it, because they didn't know carbon-14 dating was so far away. There wasn't even a concept in their heads that they were destroying this. And I think about that recording archaeological sites that I know are going to be destroyed by development. My thinking is I want to record everything, because you're right. I don't know what's going to be useful in the future. And I don't even know what's useful to me, what's important to me, because quite frankly, I'm recording someone else's history, right? It's not mine. It's somebody else's. It's Native American. It's colonial. It's settlers, explorers of the West, because I'm out here in Nevada or something like that. So that's a really big issue, and I want to go back to the comment you made that you had, in writing this book, you had to go even into a little bit of neuroscience. I mean, how much does our own psychology really play into this? Because it's got to be a huge problem. Me, as my own example, just moving right now, I mentioned to you when we had this call a few days ago that I just moved into a slightly smaller place, and we've actually gotten rid of a lot of stuff and tried to figure out what do we need, what do we don't need. And I think as humans, we have a tendency to just like keep everything just like naturally. We don't want to get rid of it because we see everything's important to us. I was talking about getting rid of books, and somebody commented on my post on Facebook, said I'd rather put an addition on my house than get rid of any of my books. And I mean, that's a huge deal, and that's how we think. So where did your research into like neuroscience come into that sort of play, or psychology?
Well, one of the things that strikes me, it's commonsensical, but neuroscientists can actually explain how this works, or at least why it works. Memory itself, and in animals, is highly conservative. It keeps a lot of stuff, but the stuff that's redundant, it tends to consolidate. The purpose of memory, I mean, there's DNA memory, there's genetic memory, and its purpose is to teach a creature how to develop into the species that it develops into. And it has enough junk in it. I mean, sorry, it used to be called junk, of course. Now we understand it's valuable, but it has a lot of archaic information that is there in some ways out of sheer, laziness. It's hard to edit things out. They tend to just drift.
Mm-hmm.
But also it becomes almost by itself something which allows adaptation. So when the environment changes and you need, you need to actually adapt to the environment, an animal, an amoeba or a zebra, whoever it is, they have other resources heretofore never tapped, which allows them potential to adapt. I mean, this is a gross generalization, but in general, we tend to keep certain kinds of things that allow us to be adaptable. So, and when we learn, though, that is when animals start to learn, including human beings, most everything, things get laid down in your memory. You develop a model of how the world works, and that's totally, completely, absolutely, and forever unconscious.
Mm-hmm.
It's laid down in parts of the brain that are completely inaccessible to human consciousness. Thank God, because we would never want to tamper with that kind of stuff. But it's, we do know now that a lot of what humans take in, there's a kind of matching process. That if it's information that is already stored in the brain, it filters it out immediately, like white noise. And it pays attention to the things that are new. I mean, incidentally, and most importantly, I'd say, this is a process that takes place unconsciously most of the time when human beings are asleep. Which means that if you don't sleep, your memory gets extremely discombobulated.
Yeah.
So there's a reason that we need to cultivate sleep as a habit for forming good memories. But it's amazing how much concrete information that is in our memory actually gets kind of generalized. It's not that specific anymore. Except in certain instances. So when you made choices about what to keep in your book collection, as an example, and I would say you should definitely get rid of books that you don't use. I personally think of them as recycling them. I mean, I give them to libraries to sell, or I give them to the Internet Archive to store and to scan and put online. So, it's not as if you're wasting a book. You could say you're wasting the book by keeping it in storage.
Right.
But, the things that you choose to get rid of, you actually probably unconsciously or maybe consciously think about what you will be using or you want to maintain the option to use in the future. That's all we need to know about memory is we store things so that we have a sense of how the world works, and then we acquire information that we think may be useful. And when we think about the future, we want to store enough information that we have something that will help us to make a choice in the future. So that's why memory is essentially, the content is the past, but it serves the function of the future. And I think that's true of your library or my household as much as it is archaeological data.
Right. That's a really good way of looking at the recycling of books thing, because I was kind of struggling with that. And I love that thought, because it is going to waste sitting on my shelf if I've already read it, and I'm not going to refer to it later. I could give it to someone else to enjoy. I like that a lot.
No, this is all fantastic. And just one of the things that continues to get me up in the morning, and actually also help me sleep well at night. So thanks for the sleep comment. Is kind of really thinking about both the affordances we now have with digital recording, but also the grave concerns we have. And that was one of the things that really struck me, Abby, both about your book, but also your work generally, which has to do with there's a quote in your book that has to do with kind of the ephemeral digital landscape and how we can all become our own digital data managers. So in archaeology, I guess what we're saying is there's a high stake, because what Chris was describing is that for legal reasons, in most cultural resource management, there are paper records that are generated, but more and more, and we're as I say guilty, but also trying to lead. There's we record everything digitally, and then we're trying to put paper in its place and trying to generate paper where it makes sense. But there's also a whole lot of concern. I mean, for obvious reasons, not just for a place where we're doing the archaeological project that actually destroys all the evidence. Therefore, what we record and how we record it should pervade, so that there are people in the future that can actually experience what we got to experience doing the archaeological work. But also, I'm wondering if perhaps maybe in the second segment, if we can talk a bit more about your call for digital literacy and scholarship, or what we like to call digital citizen archivists, so that we can figure out ways to do this more personally.
Yeah. Well, I think that a lot of people are dependent upon what are essentially consumer technologies for most of their digital life. And, I think, as I point out in the book, most people, maybe not, the people who are listening and the people on the call, but most people are unaware that the technologies they use, Gmail and Facebook and these platforms that are quote unquote free are in fact not free at all. And the people who commit their often personal data and share them through these platforms, through the miracle of these platforms, which appear to cost nothing. In fact, they exchange control of their own data for access at little or no cost to them. So I think people need to be aware of how much some of these commercial companies control the data that we own. And frankly, I think we ought to take more control over the data that we produce. Not using Gmail is not necessarily a solution to that, but making sure that you back up all your own stuff, and you don't assume that because it's on you pay for commercial storage on a cloud, that means that it's a guarantee that the stuff will be there when you want it on the terms that you want it. But the whole question of digital literacy and curating our own digital lives is something with very, very broad applications. And is of concern to many.
Right, and I think one thing as we go to break here that people tend to forget, because we say cloud all the time. The cloud is actually a room somewhere in a building, right? I mean, it's a place that can be destroyed by a numerous means, whether it's power failures or earthquakes or what have you. Now, cloud means it's distributed, so if one place gets destroyed, maybe not everything got destroyed, but as we saw from Amazon just this week, a lot of their services went down for a little while, and a lot of websites just simply didn't work. So,
yes.
All right. Well,
yeah.
We'll take a break right now, and we'll come back and talk about a little thing, that's just the security of our entire digital future. We'll solve that. All right. Back in a second.
Let's face it, the quality of archaeological field photography could really use some improvement. We aim to change this with the Codify Magic Photo Board. This lightweight but incredibly durable board is designed to help you take color-perfect photos of artifacts, features, and sites using almost any camera, even your smartphone. You need to see it to believe it. Engineered from exceptional quality, color-safe, high-pressure laminate, Codify Magic Photo Board is ready for tough field conditions. It's guaranteed to level up your photography. Start taking publication-worthy photos right in the field with the Codify Magic Photo Board. Available now for pre-order, visit codify.com/APN. That's codifi.com/APN today and get your promo code exclusively for listeners of the Archaeology Podcast Network.
Okay, and we're back from the break. And in the last segment, Abby had mentioned the importance of managing your own data and archiving in your own spaces. And we've had some conversations in the back chat while we were off on break, and I think that is an especially important point given recent events. And Michael, you can comment on this in a second. There's a 500-year mandate for archival data with the Library of Congress, and that itself is a great standard. However, it's politically determined and it's also politically uncertain. And so the data that is contained within that 500-year mandate is also politically uncertain and politically determined. And as we've seen recently, huge packages of data have been scrubbed from the record. And we've seen quote unquote rogue agents scrambling to make that data available in open sources. And we've also seen scientists and just citizen archivists grabbing all the open data they possibly can and making it available in their own server spaces or archival spaces. And so I think that the important point that Abby left off the last segment in is especially worth noting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, sure. I mean, this is it's a very tangled scheme because we just a real quick background. We participated with the Park Service and the National Center for Preservation Technology Training and did a survey of the country looking at 3D data and how to implement new procedures for recording in 3D. But the reality again is that there's no financial mandate for even doing that at all in the Park Service, and especially now, alluding to what Chris just said. So at the end of the day, you're looking for ways to record in material ways that we understand. And this resonates very well for me with what Abby, what you were saying at the very beginning of the call, which is it's hard for us to understand what people will need in the future in order to understand what we're doing now in 2017, whether it's research or writing or storytelling or whatever. But my concern about this is that we also make decisions, and decisions continue to be made based on what we understand now and are comfortable with, versus even kind of being willing to explore or figure out how to make data that we don't understand very well preservable. And this is the real challenge. Like whether we're seeing state enforcement of the redaction of climate change data or the repurposing of WhiteHouse.gov, or even if it's not as nefarious as it may all feel, just trying to figure out a way to sustain a digital future so that we can have one is, again, we're currently talking in this conversation now about this is called more of the official records that we want to generate as archaeologists and historians and researchers. But again, I would still like us to talk a bit about perhaps some handy tips we can come up with besides please don't use Facebook as your digital preservation repository, to figure out how to, I have a 5-year-old kid. My dad left me a fantastic physical archive of photos as a photographer. And I sit here daily as someone who does this for a living, trying to figure out how I best can provide, some form of memorial to my kid too. So anyway, lots of things clearly on the mind here. Abby?
Yeah, let me just say a couple of things. First, about the issue of the takedown of certain information under the present regime and the 500-year mandate from the Library of Congress, and I think most significant in this case in terms of the government is the National Archives and Records Administration, known as NARA, or the National Archives. To my mind, the challenge that those organizations have faced are not primarily the ones that are getting a lot of attention now, which is this clear to many people, the political threat of the new regime. In fact, I think the problems for these organizations began many years ago when, at least 2 or 3 decades ago, and that's when I was in the Library of Congress, and I saw what was happening, when there was the beginning of a widespread disinvestment in the public sector, period. And that means the archives is chronically underfunded, and the Library of Congress is chronically underfunded, and the funding keeps going down and down and down. And that's just for the existing record that they have in analog. The state of technology in the Library of Congress, the investment in their digital infrastructure, is a scandal. And people like to blame the previous librarian or somebody for that state. But the truth is that it's in part a very bad budget. It's the unwillingness on Congress's part to invest in these key information infrastructure of the United States, which they like to boast, they support because, well, Thomas Jefferson founded the library and we believe in open access, free access, et cetera. But I think the lie is really in the larger public disinvestment. So I think one thing that the public can do is to demand more of their members of Congress to fund these institutions. Mm-hmm. And it's not political. It's not fund this group over, these kind of data over those kind of data. That I think is if anything, a distraction right now for the more fundamental economic problem that we don't understand what the value of this information is, and so we discount it in general because investing in digital preservation seems like throwing money into a rat hole. And I've heard that term used by a university president who didn't know why they should, their university should be preserving the research data that their faculty get from, NSF, National Science Foundation grants. The disincentives for scholars, scientists, humanists in the university to preserve rather than to create data is another problem. I'd say a structural problem. So I think from my time serving on the National Science Foundation Blue Ribbon Task Force on economics of digital archiving, the fundamental problems are economic, the paying for basically a public good in a market-driven economy. So that was a mouthful, and I will. You can find a link to the report about the economic task force, which I will share with you. But I mean, that's, I think, a pretty serious issue. And then there's the politics, which maybe we know enough about that we can just pass over in silence and, in a prayer, shall we say. But I love this question about what do we do about our family? How do we actually create for our children and grandchildren a record of their own sort of extravagantly documented childhoods? I mean, we take photographs and videos of them constantly, and of course we know they do it of themselves incessantly. So how do we actually create some kind of a record of that? How do we take this superabundance of stuff that we create in documentary form and actually try to make it into something a little more scarce? And here I'm talking about editing. Mm-hmm. Do you remember when we had to actually pay a lot of money for film? And if you wanted to take a photograph, you would actually take maybe one or two, you'd bracket the exposure and the focus. And then you'd try to look at, if anything, you would develop it as a negative or a slide, because it actually cost a fair amount of money to create a print. So there was this kind of built-in scarcity, which, shall we say, no longer exists in the digital world. So how many images of our kids and grandkids do we have on our cloud? I mean, I would say the first thing we need to do, and painful as it is to actually spend time with our records and edit them. There are algorithms that these companies like Apple and Google are providing for sorting through our photos. I will applaud the day when they develop a consumer, purchasable algorithm that will allow us to make our own selections of our family photos and our family trips, so that we actually can decide of the 3,000 that we've taken in the past 3 months, which 100 will satisfy for a record of the past 3 months. We can do it. We just can't do it by looking at every image. We need a computer. We need a machine-readable choice, because machines are going to read these images.
That seems like a huge problem of education too, because I don't know how many times I see somebody who's maybe not too computer savvy, maybe not understanding their smartphone very well, which is probably half, if not 75% of the people on Facebook, since all the kids have gone to Snapchat. But it's you see them put up a series of pictures about an event. They were at a graduation, they were at something like that, and they put up 50 pictures that they just, bam, dumped it onto Facebook, and maybe only 10 of those are actually halfway decent pictures. They've got pictures with their finger in it, 700 pictures of the same exact thing, and they're just not, they don't seem very good about filtering out what's keepable and what you should actually delete. that's just anecdotal evidence right there, but yeah.
It demands a lot of attention.
It does.
And it's easy to say, well, of course, their brains are underdeveloped and they don't know how to pay attention to these things and they don't understand the long-term value of it. But frankly, I think I have the same problem with people my age.
Mhm.
So, I think parents and grandparents have the same problem, that it's a human nature to keep moving forward. And I have this, I came up with this idea while writing the book because I got to a point in finishing the book when I thought, man, this is gloomy. I mean, what are we going to do? But I also ardently believe that technologies are tools that humans create. And they have powers that we don't understand until we start to use them and abuse them, and they abuse us in turn. But over time, we learn to actually corral and to discipline the technologies that we use. And I don't, as a historian, don't believe this is going to happen in our generation, that we become so used to the hazards of digital abundance that we begin to actually build almost automatic ways to filter out this kind of redundant information. But as someone who's knows something about the printing revolution and of course the audio and the AV revolution, and even having lived through the television revolution, it took us quite a while, took each generation, actually multiple generations, to understand how to use those technologies responsibly. And so I think that it'll take one or two generations of born digital natives to get to the age when they're 80, and they're probably going to live much longer than that, and they look back retrospectively and they begin to understand that they need to be shaping the record and that they need to inculcate in the next several generations, early on growing up, teaching children how to use this technology in a way that makes it more accessible. And as I said, I also think as consumers, we need to demand more of the companies that who make these technologies for us.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, just again, this is absolutely fantastic and and still a little bit scary, But,
I think it's very scary, but
yeah, one thing I just want to say, I mean, basically the question is like, if there was one question I could have asked you, I've already asked it, and we are talking about it, and that is what we can do to kind of inspire folks to become their own citizen archivists, if you will, and you hit it, which is we need to figure out both technological but also kind of human training ways of editing and curating and making that a possibility. But one thing I got to say that's actually a very, from my perspective, recent, meaning just the last couple of years, kind of movement, and it's given me a bit of hope, is that I am seeing several instances of millennials who actually are interested in this, we're getting this kind of digital fatigue happening. And I see this as an opportunity actually to get us to think a bit more about what matters. So perhaps we'd love to hear a bit more thoughts on this, because if we kind of circle back to what the book represented for all of us, I think, you're taking a look at memory over the very broad terms, and we are having an archaeological conversation here. So looking at things that matter from a community, cultural context, personal, family context, professional, all of these different levels, and how we might be able to encourage people to kind of improve, and as you said, to kind of be self-edit, besides Snapchat, which is the actual destruction of the ephemeral moment, but also what can be added to just increase the quality and experience of what we're doing. I don't know. I mean, I guess until you have kids, you just really don't get this, but
I really think that there's something about human nature and the way that we grow which makes some of this question moot. I really do think that human beings, in some ways, the entire fact that we're, culture-based creatures is extraordinary. And there are a lot of people who go through their lives, probably the majority of people who don't even think about the ways that the general culture shapes their personality and the choices that they make, the clothes they wear, the kind of music they love. All these things that they consider extremely personal choices are in fact just choices that our particular culture offers to us. I'm not sure that everybody needs to be worried about this, and I don't think everybody can be worried about this. But I think that those who are aware of this issue, those who are involved in building and selling the technologies of recording memories, need to be far more responsible to their public obligation to the shared culture that we create. Just as I think, and this is an old story, but it's endlessly repeated. I do believe that the private companies that make the creative content in the United States and in most market economies, the Sony Pictures, the RKOs, the Universals, it isn't just that they're making commercial product. What they do is they sell products which become very intrinsic parts of people's spiritual lives.
Mm-hmm.
The films that we watch as kids, the music that we hear as children that shapes our soundscape for the rest of our lives. And it's so profound that, in fact, most people grow up nowadays thinking that music is free and should be free. They don't understand that the creator has to create it. So I really think that, again, we need to be far more demanding of the commercial companies that create this content, and not that we need to, and again, we talk about this at some length in this economic task force report because, there were economists there who were thinking about how to solve this problem. The market economy that allows Google and Apple and Universal Pictures and things like this to make all of this creative content and sell it to us also has an obligation to, when they are through with the commercial product itself and they no longer wish to pay for the care and feeding of these digital files of movies, that rather than just pulling the plug on them because it's, after all, their private property, that they actually ought to be obligated to offer it to archives and libraries and other public institutions that can preserve these cultural memories on behalf of the public and make them freely available. We don't have to take everything, but I think a lot of what we think of as our personal memories, our favorite music and our favorite films and television shows, that somehow we feel own because in some ways they have shaped us.
Mm-hmm.
We know we don't want them to disappear, and I think those companies really have an obligation to pass them into the public domain, and that we have an obligation as citizens and taxpayers to support the institutions like the Library of Congress or a research library that will take them. That's different than our family pictures, but it's the same issue that there are really only a couple of sectors of the whole community that are concerned, are aware of and concerned about culture, but the ones who are really have this special obligation to make good on the promise of keeping it. I mean, I would say the same way that I don't know very much about the military and intelligence. I don't know very much about the automobile industry, but I've placed my trust in those organizations to protect me, and when I'm driving one of their cars, to make sure that it is safe.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a very specialized economy. Those of us who care about this have to have special responsibilities, I think, on behalf of others.
That's right. I think we all totally agree with that. And as we're just about out of time here, Abby, thanks a lot for this. You've given us a lot to think about, and I hope people go check your book out. Are you planning on any sort of follow-up to this that you can let us know about, or expansion on any of the other ideas in that book that'll be out in a little while?
Nothing that'll be out in a little while, but stay tuned because I am working on, the book was originally, as you can imagine, much, much longer than it is now. And there are a lot of episodes, things that I took out that I'm now developing in other forms. So stay tuned.
Awesome. Well, we'll have you back on to talk about those for sure. And maybe periodically as we do this, because as I said, Michael and Chris and I are partnering on an application that does a lot of this stuff. When you're saying we need to hold these people responsible, you're talking to us too, and we feel that burden as well. So, but thank you very much for coming on the show, and
it's been such a pleasure. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, and be sure to check out the links we have in the show notes. Okay. Women in Archaeology is a show about archaeology by the women of archaeology. An alternating panel of women archaeologists discuss the issues in archaeology that impact professionals and the public every day. Check out Women in Archaeology for a different perspective on the past today at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/WIA. Now let's get back to the show.
Okay, and we're back from the break for our final segment of this show. And again, I'd like to thank Abby Rumsey for joining this episode. It was a real treat to speak with her, and Michael Ashley as well. A lot of great information, a lot of serious, heavy stuff to ponder. So the app that I'm going to review on this episode is called PlantNet, and it's available on iOS and on the Google Play Store. And I don't know how I ended up doing this, but the last several apps that I've reviewed on this show have been available on both iOS and Google Play or Android. So, I'm not intentionally trying to reach out of the iOS. Webby and I were just discussing this, how both of us use iPhones. So here for the most part of Archaeotech, since we've rebooted it, we tend to focus on iOS apps just because that's what we use. But, we're always looking out for more apps. So, feel free to send us a line and let us know if there's an app that you're thinking about that's, useful for archaeology, even tangentially. I'm sure you've heard several of the apps that we've reviewed here lately, only have, very, very loose affiliation with anthropology or archaeology. So on that note, the app that I'm reviewing this time, PlantNet, is there's an article that I'm linking in the show notes. It's being billed as Shazam for plants. So you can take a picture of any plant and it will be able to identify it. Now there's limitations. There's serious limitations to this thing. I started to download it, and before I even started using it, I was reading reviews and reading articles about it and stuff. There's nothing available for it in North America, to my understanding. They're working on it. It's a database that you can take pictures of plants, upload them, and it was developed by a team of 4 French researchers who were doing work in like Latin America, Asia, and North Africa, I believe. Mm-hmm. There's 4 regions. I think there's an area of Europe that it's available in as well. I could be wrong, but anyhow, it's very limited right now. It's still starting off, but I'm reviewing it because I think that there's a lot of potential, especially for archaeobotany. I've spoken with a few archaeobotanists in my lifetime who have wanted something like this. So this is something to take note of and just kind of keep on your radar. Again, the app is called PlantNet. There's going to be links for it in the show notes. Go check it out. The problem seems to be just a lack of data and a lack of users. So with more engagement, I think that'll that problem will be improved. Now, one of the other things that I'm not sure of, I tried to figure out if there's any sort of moderation or like review for the submissions. I don't know that. So I don't know how accurate the data is. I don't know if there's, problems with misspellings or, inaccuracies and whatnot. So, again, something to just keep your mind on. But I think it's a really neat thing that has a lot of potential, again, with some applications for archaeology, especially working with, Webby, you and I have done some loose work with indigenous knowledge and uses of traditional plants and stuff like that. So, I think that that's something that could see a good application there. But yeah, Webby, I'll hand it over to you, and we can hear about your app.
Well, I can comment on this first. You know what I need? I need a shrub app because there aren't any plants in the Great Basin. I mean, there are plants, but
well, there's just like sagebrush and tumbleweed, right?
Right? So, but anyway, this is really similar to, and I think it looks like they do things similarly, but it would be a good companion app to LeafSnap, which I had years ago, and I actually wrote a blog post about probably 4 years ago. And I just pulled up their website, and they still exist, which is great. But it looks like the plant app, it uses a visual database. So you actually just take a picture of the plant and upload it. And like you said, it looks like people are verifying this, or somehow it says they have visualization software that can kind of identify it. The way Leaf Snap works is you have to take the leaf off the tree, or I guess put something behind it if it's a big enough leaf, and it wants a pure white background in the back, because of what it does is you take a picture, and then it does a high contrast photo, and it turns the leaf black against the white background, because you can identify any plant based on the lobes and pointiness of its leaves, right? So, and that's how that works, and that builds also a database across the country. And God, I was using this probably 4 or 5 years ago. Their database must be enormous by now. But the problem with Leaf Snap is you don't always have something white to take a picture of it in the background. You don't always have a really good way to take that picture. But with Plant App, it looks like you can just take the picture. I think if you were really, really unsure of what this was, you'd use both apps and see if they come to a consensus on, what this thing actually is. So it's kind of cool, though. I've had the same exact idea for projectile points. It would take a massive database, but basically taking a picture of the point on a contrasting background, and then you could get all the measurements you want automatically, because the app would just do it for you, and then tell you, this point. The thing you would find that would be interesting is if you took a picture of, say, out here in the West, an Elko corner notch, it wouldn't come up and say exclusively, this is an Elko corner notch, which would be eye-opening for archaeologists. It would say, this is a point that has 25 different names across the whole entire country. So here's where you can find it. Which I think people need to know.
Yeah, same deal in the Southeast. There's so much debate over like localized expressions of various cultural phases of projectile points, and even when ceramic technology is introduced, there's localized expressions of that. But for projectile points, it's just one of those things. I feel like every region has basically the same kind of morphology or like loose range of morphology, but there's so much argument over the name of it because they're like, no, it's a localized expression.
Right. Well, the technology of making projectile points is, I don't want to say limited, but there is a finite number of ways you can do it, right? To hack this point onto something, and the general progression from spear to atlatl to bow and arrow to I guess crossbow, really. I don't think Native Americans use crossbows, but anyway, you know what I mean. From that progression on, there's only so many ways to half that onto a piece of wood. So even if it were independently invented and wasn't just cultural transmission across the landscape, if it were independently invented in 50 different places, the invention would look basically the same. I mean, it would have to, right? So it might be different spans of time. Like you see this point morphing into another point in different areas. You'd have different time periods where that idea took hold. It probably wasn't all at the same time, but that's... Anyway, we're getting off track. I could talk about that for hours.
I was just about to say, hey, we could do a whole podcast on why projectile points are such a strange thing in various regions.
I know, we really should actually. But anyway, that being said, I'm just really irritated that Clovis Point is the only one that has like one name across 2 continents. But in reality, lots of points should. So yeah, it's probably because it holds a consistent time frame across those 2 continents. You can see the sort of transfer. Anyway, we could, like you said, we could dive into this. I'm throwing plates around. Apparently, I'm so angry about it. That reminds me, I should probably take my medication and lower my blood pressure, because that's the app I'm going to talk about. It's called Round. Roundhealth.co is the address. We'll have links in the show notes. And again, another thing Chris and I were talking about before we started. This is not an app review show. This is a segment we just decided to do where, it's apps that we use. So if we don't hit Android apps all the time, it's because we don't have an Android device to search those with. And that's another case here with the Round app. As far as I can tell, they only have iOS. And I'm sure, but I think still that this is a good thing to know about, because there's got to be Android equivalents or whatever your tablet, whatever you're using. And as long as you know this type of app exists, it might be able to help you. So what it is it's basically it reminds you to take pills, honestly. I mean, if you're a woman, women take pills all the time, for various things because they have to. And guys, of course, take pills as well. I try not to take any sort of pills if I can help it. I mean, I'll suffer through a headache and just know that it'll be gone the next day, because I just will not take something for it. That being said, I had an angiogram a few weeks ago, and as where they scoped my heart, and as a result, I have to take, just for a couple months, I have to put this plastic nitroglycerin patch on my chest to release nitroglycerin into my system to increase the flow of blood, plus heart blood pressure medication once a day that allows me that expands your blood vessels, so it makes them less constrictive, and then also a cholesterol pill. So, plus a baby aspirin, like an 81 milligram aspirin. So I've got to take all those for a few months. Well, I found out the hard way that if you take if you put the nitro on and then take the blood pressure medication at the same time, you'll get a massive migraine. Because what it does is it releases all your blood vessels and then shoves a whole bunch of blood through them. So, and I wasn't told to take these at any certain time of day. The nitro patch I have to take in the morning because it's supposed to be 12 hours on, 12 hours off kind of thing. But, the others I can take any time. So I looked for an app, and this happens to have an Apple Watch app too. So my watch, you can basically set in the exact type of pill it is. So if you go to the doctor or something like that, you can just pull up this app and say, this is exactly what I'm taking and when I'm taking it. And you can set a window for taking it. Like if I want to take it at 7 o'clock in the morning, I set the nitro patch, I think, for 6, and I put a 2-hour window on it. So between 5 and 7, it's going to ping me and say, did you take this medication? And all I have to do is tap on my watch, hit yes, I took it, or open up the app on my phone and hit yes, I took it. And then it'll continuously ping me. After it goes outside that window, it'll give me push notifications on my phone like every 15 minutes saying, you better take your medication, So, because you wouldn't think it'd be hard to forget, it's your life, it's your health, but damn, is it hard to forget? And that's why I took some of them all at once, because I woke up at like 6 o'clock in the morning, didn't take anything, and it was 8 o'clock, and I'm like, oh shit. And then I went and took my nitro, took the aspirin, and then took the blood pressure medication, and then got a massive migraine. So anyway, I know as archaeologists, our lives can be, really discombobulated sometimes, especially if we're in a new setting, we're in a hotel, we're in a tent or something like that, and it's hard to keep our lives regular. So apps like this can help keep us on track and not forgetting those things that we have to do that are regular in our lives when we're overturning our lives in so many other ways.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of value for apps like that kind of maintain some stability and normalcy as apps tend to assist us in like increasing our mobility. So, that sounds like a pretty neat app, and I'm sure I could use it at some point or another as well.
Yeah, I mean, even if you were using it to take vitamins, and you wanted to just remember, or like if you're anything you're taking that's like daily or periodic, honestly, you could use it for anything that's got a periodic nature to it. It doesn't have to be medication, because you can set in custom stuff. If you're like, I want a Coke Zero every day at 11, then you can put that in there.
I need a cold brew coffee every 5 hours, exactly every 5 hours. Otherwise, I die.
Oh my God. I'm going to add coffee to this and add like a 30-minute window to it 7 times a day, just so it goes off and reminds me to drink coffee, because I forget that, quite honestly. But anyway, but you could set it for like if you had an Apple Watch and you wanted to put your phone away, or even if your phone's accessible while you're on survey. I don't know how many times I forget to drink water. And as ridiculous as that sounds, you get busy, you get doing survey, you get walking around, you just forget. And before you know it, you've got a headache and you can't figure out why. It's because you're freaking dehydrated. So, set this thing up for every 30 minutes or every hour or whatever your minimum is, and say, that's your prescription. My prescription is H2O, and I need to take water now, and just take a couple sips. I think that could be extremely valuable. So, and think about that for other applications too. It doesn't have to be just for, whatever it says it's for. Look at the utility of the application and then say, how can I make this work for my situation and for archaeology, and for what I'm doing and for my life? And this is free, so you can't beat it.
Nice.
All right. And I think yours is free too, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and Leaf Snap is free as well if anybody wants to check that out. So I think that's all we've got. All we've got for today. I'd love to hear your comments and how you're using these applications or anything else you're using. We say this every time. We want people to comment. What apps are you using out there? Please, Android users, let us know so we can take a look at them, even if it's just on the website, and maybe do some kind of review about them and let other people know. So, Chris, you got anything else?
Nope. On that note, I'm gonna mosey down the street and go get some more coffee.
Nice. I think I'm gonna go add Westworld to this app so I know to watch it when it comes on.
Yeah.
Also, so I can go, up my stock in Monsanto. All right, so we're out.
Carl, we love you.
We love you, Carl. That's it for this week. We got some other good shows coming up, some interesting stuff on GIS that we're planning. So hopefully we didn't lose just half of our listeners right there, but please listen to those episodes. And we'll see you guys next time. Thanks.
Bye.
That's it for another episode of the Archaeotech Podcast. Links to some of the items mentioned on the show are in the show notes for this podcast, which can be found at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com/archaeotech. If you like the show and want to comment, please do. You can leave comments about this or any other episode on the website or on the iTunes page for this episode. You can also email us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com or use the contact form on the podcast webpage. If you'd like us to answer a question on a future episode, email us. Use the contact form on the website or tweet your questions with the hashtag Archaeotech or tag @ArcPodNet in your tweet. Please share the link to this show wherever you saw it. If you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, you can do so on iTunes or on Stitcher Radio. You can also type the name of the podcast into your favorite podcasting app and subscribe that way. Don't forget to go over to iTunes and leave a review of the show. It helps us get noticed so more people can find our podcast and benefit from the content. Also, send us show suggestions and interview suggestions. We want this to be a resource for field technicians everywhere, and we want to know what you want to know about. This show is produced by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, and edited by Chris Sims.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.
Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to arcpodnet.com/members for more info.